Hey guys, this is Tho Bishop with Radio Rothbard, and I want to let you guys know about another great Mises event we have coming up on November 4th in Fort Myers, Florida. As you know, everyday Americans feel the political capture of the economy. Inflation, taxes, and regulatory costs hit our paychecks and our savings. The regulatory capture of the medical industries, food and energy production, and the various instruments of big tech empower the regime with new tools to promote their latest ideological cause. The ever-growing burden of government debt has become a crisis without any political will to address it. We're going to be talking about these very issues at this event in Fort Myers. And best of all, we have a discount code for Radio Rothbard listeners. If you use promo code RR2023, RR as in Radio Rothbard 2023, you'll get $10 off at this event. If you want to learn more, visit Mises.org/FL2023, FL as in Florida. Look forward to seeing you there.
Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken. I'm senior editor with the Mises Institute. And with me, of course, is my co-host, Tho Bishop. And we're back for another episode. And we're going to talk a little bit about not directly the Israel-Hamas war, but its effects on domestic policy in the United States, and what should we expect? And if you've been around for a while, if you remember the days after 9/11, you remember 2003, 2002, you know that we're in a very dangerous time when the pro-war faction, much of which will include the Republican Party, they don't want to let a crisis go to waste. This was a term used a lot, of course, during COVID, where conservatives who were actually good on COVID pointed this quotation out a whole lot, was that, hey, there's a crisis on, they're going to use it to massively increase government power and control over our lives. Look out. Well, we're back in this very similar situation. We're going to try and use a problematic foreign policy situation to impose more regime control on the lives of Americans and make them pay a whole lot more money to do whatever it is that the regime wants to do. So let's look at some of the specifics, and I guess I'll just get the ball rolling with something that's at this point fairly speculative and isn't related to a lot of the other topics necessarily, but I think it won't be long before we start to see growing calls for the United States to host a lot of Palestinian refugees, and this is going to follow the usual pattern where the United States goes in, participates in a war, helps destroy an entire country or a few cities. The refugees come streaming out because their homes have all been destroyed by the hundreds of thousands. And then Americans are lectured about the need to host these refugees because of something that their regime did. And certainly this has been more of a big deal in Europe, where the numbers have been larger, but certainly in the United States as well, where Americans have been expected to host Syrian refugees and Iraqi refugees, which would not have been necessary had the United States not bombed these countries. And so I think what we're likely to see now is Palestine, specifically the Gaza Strip, bombed with a whole lot of U.S. money, and then Americans will be browbeaten into hosting tens of thousands, if not even more, of the refugees created by American war spending. And we've already seen this to some extent with Jamal Bowman, that member of Congress who pulled the fire alarm in an attempt to disrupt voting in the House, and of course now faces no sanction whatsoever for interfering with voting. If you're an 80-year-old grandma and you interfere with voting, you go to prison for years. But if you're Jamal Bowman, you probably get a medal. And he's now saying that Americans should be hosting Gazan refugees. So get ready for that. That's something we're going to be hearing. It could be that the GOP will capitalize on Islamophobia to keep that from happening. Maybe the odds of that happening are low. But I think that's just one thing that's probably fairly predictable. It's just hard to say how much traction it's going to get at this time.
Worth looking back at some of the estimates out there for the number of people that were displaced as a result of the America War on Terror. And I've seen estimates out there, one by Brown University's Cost of War project, that estimated that 37 million people were displaced as a result of various conflicts, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, Philippines, and Libya, all being worked into their figures there. 9.2 coming from Iraq, 7.1 from Syria, 5.3 from Afghanistan, and the rest from there. And you are already seeing, obviously there's an element of the Democratic Party. It's interesting. This conflict, I think, is causing strife on both within both parties from some of the growing ideological factions. You have certain Republicans. You have half that are really very much kind of embracing an immigration hard line on this. Ron DeSantis has been making this a major part of his campaign rhetoric the last few days. You have sort of the invade the world, invite the world Republican sect that's out there. Nikki Haley has been pushing back against some of DeSantis's rhetoric on that. On the Democratic side, you have kind of your, essentially simplify it as Hillary Clinton brand Democrats that have taken a very strong Israeli side on this, and then you have what might be overly simplified as the squad that's taking sort of a social justice narrative to the conflict, and this not only involves their reaction to this on a foreign policy foundation, but does wrap around to the role that they see the government should be taking on domestic issues, particularly refugees and immigration questions. And of course, this has been a major issue. The continent that has dealt the most with the pressures from this, slightly off topic from a domestic conversation, but is Europe. And you're seeing, France, for example, cracking down on pro-Palestinian protest as a response to that, because the amount of people from the Middle East, again, moved out, displaced because of the war on terror. You have major growing communities of people with ties to the Middle East, ties to Gaza, ties to just heightened awareness of this from an ethnic dimension there, from a religious perspective there, and this is creating very real issues within Europe. Concerns with this has created political pressure that has fueled populist anti-EU sentiments for a while now, but this is only kind of being kind of juiced up to the front burner once again. Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD party in Germany, has already been on the rise in response to economic populism, inflation rates, and a variety of other concerns, part of it being pre-existing concerns over the immigration problem. I have a feeling that they are only going to be further strengthened as a result of these tensions out there. And you see these things coming up, and when we're dealing with something, I think the hubris of the sort of current political era, where the assumption was that so long as we have a democratic process, and we can kind of unite these people with very different backgrounds under a common taxpayer, that we can solve all this stuff with all the great tools that modern. I know you don't like the word neoliberal, but neoliberal, democratic policies, however you want to phrase the current world order, that all these things can just be wrapped around with pure political will. And I have a feeling that that's probably not going to play out, particularly when you have, I think, the extreme emotions that an Israeli-led counteroffensive is going to play out. So I think there's a lot of assumptions that have guided Western governments, including the U.S., that are going to be very severely tested in the next coming months.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you can check out, if you're interested in more on this, Zach Yost and I, in our most recent War, Economy, and State podcast, talked about the role of a variety of ethnic interest groups in the U.S. driving American foreign policy. And those people don't move here and then just all blend into a melting pot and then just abandon any whatever allegiances they might have had to the country of origin. So I think that is going to continue to be an issue. Now, another issue that we might note is that it seems the strategy here is to keep the Ukraine war going, essentially cloaking it in support for Israel. As far as I can tell, the plan now is to just wrap up together foreign policy support, many billions of dollars for both Ukraine and Israel into single foreign aid packages. And you would think that the way that the world is freaking out over the Levant, that Ukraine would very much go on the back burner. And I think it is going to go on the back burner in the sense of media coverage. You're seeing very, very little about Ukraine now in the headlines, which at this point is probably good for Ukraine, at least as far as U.S. domestic policy goes, because support has been slipping fast. People are sick of Zelensky, who's just something of a man-child who shows up and makes a bunch of demands and has nothing to show for it. And if he kind of recedes into the background, then it's probably even easier then for Congress to say, oh, well, we just look away. We sent them another $40 billion. But that was part of a larger aid package, which helps Israel as well. So I don't see any real effect on Ukraine support here unless the GOP really finds a way to push cutting back on that monetary support. It's probably now just going to be baked into the foreign aid numbers. But I could be wrong. It could be that the military situation will worsen there to the point where people recognize that it's futile and pointless. But as far as I can see, the Israel situation doesn't particularly hurt Ukraine. It makes it easier for people in back rooms and insider deals, through insider deals, to put more money together through Ukraine and just keep that gravy train going. And so we should expect that at least for another year in Ukraine, in spite of whatever might be going on in Israel.
Currently, the most recent buzz in D.C. is that the Biden administration is pushing for a $100 billion foreign aid package that includes money for Israel and Ukraine. You'll note the way those two are listed there, Israel and Ukraine. And yet, from early reports, the majority of that $100 billion is expected to go to Ukraine, with $10 billion of that 100 being purposed for Israel. There's obviously American support for Israel, as our audience, I'm sure, is extremely aware of. There's been very robust support for the Israeli military coming from D.C. for quite some time. In fact, in 2016, there was a decision made that basically set auto pay for Israeli military support up to close to $4 billion every year. So even when there was a lot of statements by pro-Israeli politicians pointing to the drama that is still unfolding in the Speaker of the House issue and how that was holding up Washington and their ability to deal with this in obviously a very pro-Israeli state way. There's been an automatic funding mechanism in there for quite some time that is, I think, fairly unique to Israel. So yeah, absolutely. The ability to lump these two together is going to be a major boon to the Mitch McConnells, to the Joe Bidens, to the uniparty apparatus as a whole, where you really had seen growing restraint. I spoke to someone that works for a pro-Ukraine aid congressman of late, and voicing the lack of support that such policies had in the district that I live in. And at the time, this was before the Saturday of Hamas's attack. There seemed to be kind of broad acceptance that any further interest in Ukraine was quickly losing any sort of political potency. I do not have a feeling that's going to be a problem going forward. So it's while there is going to be some PR dynamics out there, right? Zelensky was not accepted as a guest in Israel of late during the American, during Blinken's, run through the Middle East and meeting with various state actors in the region. That was not necessarily a great PR dynamic for Zelensky. I do not think he is going to be going broke anytime soon. And it's also worth noting, though, that Israel had been one of the more reluctant countries in terms of providing military aid to the Ukrainian situation, because of their own defensive concerns and the like, which, given the state failure of Israel in the time of crisis, the kind of a different situation there. But I know that there was some interesting stuff out there about the degree to which American weapon reserves that were typically based in Israel had been relocated into Ukraine for that conflict. So I have no doubt that this $100 billion aid package is not going to be the end of Washington's attempts to rearm both sides of things. But definitely, I think being able to use the cover of Israel and the significantly higher level of public opinion support for assisting Israeli military aid is going to end up, once again, sending more money to Ukraine.
So Americans, you can't pay your rent. Even a small trip to the grocery store costs you $100. But don't worry. Zelensky and the Ukrainian oligarchs will continue to enrich themselves on your hard-earned cash. So I don't think this war will distract from that.
Well, and of course, you had Janet Yellen reassure the world that don't worry. The U.S. is in a position to fund. To certainly, we can fund two active war fronts. So again, as long as Janet Yellen says it's okay, we have nothing to worry about. Of course, Connor O'Keefe has a great article on The Wire this week addressing that very issue. But it's okay. Janet Yellen says we're perfectly fine. That money printer will keep going hot. We'll see what Jay Powell has to say about that. But Janet Yellen assures us that don't worry, we can certainly finance both sides of this conflict.
Yes, Janet Yellen, geopolitical expert and expert on inflation too, who called our current inflation rate perfectly and knew exactly what was going on her whole time as chairman of the Fed. I mean, just remarkable who you're expected to listen to in Washington and take these people seriously. But just for the general position is clear, right? Reading the Washington Post over the weekend, and it was we can just look at a typical line from one column from the 15th by a Post writer named Danielle Allen. It says, it was all very dramatic, maudlin language about how the United States is being pulled into the darkness by the conflict in Israel. And just this, a very effective sort of language for people who haven't been paying attention to planet Earth for the last 100 years and think that this is some sort of new frontier in terrible warfare. But her main point of the article was to say, quote, "We must continue helping our allies win these wars," quote unquote. So she was tying the whole Ukraine and Israel thing very much together as it's an ongoing part of the war for democracy. So the position hasn't changed at all. It's still maintaining that line about how, hey, this is all about democracy. If there's any sort of barbarism going out there, the real problem is that it's a threat to democracy. And I don't think we'll see any real change in that rhetoric. It is harder to tie what's going on to Israel to what's going on in terms of threats, everyday threats to Americans in the United States. So fortunately, it isn't like 9/11 in the sense that Americans are completely freaking out and are going to support whatever it is the regime tells them to do in terms of fighting the enemy, whoever that might be. But I think it does make it significantly easier to call for more U.S. support for international war simply by claiming, these people are coming for you next. And that seems to be some of what's going on there. And that takes us to our next topic, and I think that is, are we going to see more calls for anti-terrorism federal powers from the federal government? Of course, that's already been so massively expanded over the last 20 years through the Patriot Act, through the FISA courts blatantly abusing their power, through nonstop spying by the NSA. I mean, there's so much going on that was not permissible 23 years ago, and which Americans now just accept as just everyday spy powers from the federal government. But I'm sure they can come up with plenty of new stuff that they want. And you're starting to see some early rumblings of that. FBI's Christopher Wray, a truly despicable person, is already out there saying, look out. Hamas is coming next and planning terror attacks on U.S. soil. Hey, local law enforcement, tell the FBI everything. Get us involved in whatever it is you're doing every day. And so they're clearly priming the pump for new and additional federal powers and federal activity throughout the nation in terms of anti-terrorism. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But I haven't seen a whole lot of very specific calls for any new legislation or powers at this point. But of course, America's kind of past the point where you pass actual legislation to give vast new powers to the federal government. It's just, hey, we'll pass some executive orders and voila, the FBI can now do this new thing. And so unless they get real pushback from the GOP on that, as long as, for the moment, right, once you get a Republican in the White House again, I can't imagine much opposition there from anybody. But at the moment, you might continue to see some opposition from the GOP based on whatever latest police powers Biden wants. But I haven't seen a whole lot of specifics on that. But the FBI is behaving exactly as you would expect, claiming that their role is all the more important, and they're planning new attacks on American soil. So be ready, and we can't let down our guard now. So the rhetoric there is very similar to what we saw in 2002. It's just a question of how they're going to translate that into hard policy.
And of course, it'd be interesting to see how the priorities of the FBI shift, given the focus from, particularly the Biden administration has been on, Moms for Liberty groups and people yelling at the school board and January 6ers and just a couple weeks before the attacks in Israel, you had it reported that there was a whole new task force dedicated to dealing with the MAGA extremists and et cetera, et cetera. So I am interested to see how that shift of the FBI's priorities, does it remain, particularly going into an election season? Do they continue to prioritize the political opposition over concerns dealing with a new terror threat? I mean, obviously, the call for new resources will be there regardless of it. Again, perfect justification to bump up their budget once more, and if not immediately, then the ability for the FBI's terror factory to create a new reason for that is certainly well proven to be an effective operation on that side. I do think, though, that one thing that is worth discussing, and you had an article last week in the immediate aftermath talking about the need for America to stay out of the conflict broadly. But I think unlike the Ukraine situation, which would require a significant escalation and engagement with NATO and Russia to bring American troops into that conflict, we are already seeing moves by the U.S. military. Reports of 2,000 Marines heading into the theater there. American aircraft carriers en route over there. The danger we saw recently play out. Riots and protests going on in front of American embassies throughout the Middle East. And I think the real concern is, does this evolve into a hot war situation that brings America directly into the fold in some way? And obviously, that escalation would only further amplify these broader dynamics, whether it's on the economic front, on the civil liberties front, on just the dangers, of a growing, multinational, the prospects of a multinational war breaking out from this. War is the health of the state, and that dynamic is something that I think makes this situation even more dangerous than anything that we have seen so far play out on the Ukraine-Russia dynamic, and something that we should all be praying for it not to get to that point.
Well, and that brings us to the next topic, where I think in terms of very specific new foreign policy agitation you're going to see is for war with Iran. And we know the neoconservatives have wanted war with Iran for a long, long time, really since the days of talking about war with Iraq back in 2002, 2003. They would have been perfectly happy with a two-pronged war, including Iran at that time. Of course, Iran is much larger than Iraq, much more difficult to actually fight a war there. But boy, that's just been nonstop talk, really, among the warmongers for the last 20-something years. John McCain was obsessed with the idea, and it's just never really gone away. And so now you've got Iran, which is known to funnel funds to Hamas and Hezbollah, which is up in Lebanon. And don't forget, by the way, there was a 2007-2008 conflict between Hezbollah and Israel, which Hezbollah won, where a lot of that is done with Iranian funds. And so they're going to use, I think, that connection then to agitate for war with Iran. And they maybe see this as their chance, finally, to get a full-blown, full-on bombing campaign, boots on the ground, Iraq-style invasion in Iran is certainly the goal that some of these people clearly want. And I can't imagine Nikki Haley would have any problem with a new war in Iran. And probably people like Joe Lieberman and his group. He's still out there, the former U.S. senator who always was agitating for a war with Iran. And I would expect that to be where they start to get very specific in terms of where they want new war. And that would, of course, be disastrous, highly expensive, draw the U.S. into additional conflict with both Russia and China, and, of course, massively drive up the price of oil because the Biden administration insists on restricting oil production in North America, even though the North Americans could easily be self-sufficient in terms of oil production. And so that all stands to create some significant economic and political disruptions within the United States. The question is, have Americans learned their lesson yet on that? I think maybe some progress has been made where Americans didn't fall for the call for boots on the ground in Syria. The Americans invaded Syria anyway with a small-scale invasion in eastern Syria, but that was mostly kept off the front pages, and there wasn't a need for a whole lot of support for that, for the executive branch to get that going. That would be harder to do with Iran, unless all they want is just yet another small-scale occupation in Iran so they can just interfere with the regime there. Who knows? There's a variety of different options, but I think we should definitely expect to see calls for further escalation with Iran, which then feeds right into your fears of a larger regional war. And I think that was probably the likely place where you would then see the most escalation, and also which pulls us in with other global powers as well.
Yeah, many of the pundits out there that were the biggest cheerleaders of the Iraq war, turning on Fox News, and you have Lindsey Graham up there talking about holy war. You feel like you're transported back to 2001, 2002, which is terrifying to see. You have people like Mark Levin. You have Ben Shapiro, which I don't want to give Ben Shapiro too much credit for for Iraq War promotion, right? I mean, he was can't recall off the top of my head how young he was. He was given a very elevated platform at a very young age, but I mean, I don't want to give him too much credit in hindsight for his significance back during those discussions. But there is a continuing drumbeat that if America doesn't do everything that Israel wants to do, then we for one, that we are all at risk. Two, that will help trigger Iran or Israel into a nuclear retaliation, to responding to antagonistic Middle Eastern countries, including Iran. And we know that Netanyahu has been pushing for a war in Iran for a very long time. Again, perhaps should have spent less time focusing on Iran war plans and more time protecting the border of from Gaza there. But also, if you look at it, I mean, it's interesting from the domestic Israeli perspective, right? There's a lot of parallels that have been drawn between 9/11 and the recent attacks in Israel. You have some very stupid, sort of lines out there where people are saying, oh, well, no one, this is a Dr. Eli David, who is a large Twitter following, a researcher and lecturer according to his bio, that nobody was saying on 9/11 that America was to retaliate proportionally. Both sides need to show restraint. Where's the proof of all the dead bodies? You're oversimplifying. There's context about the conflict you're ignoring. Let's try to de-escalate the situation. For one, plenty of people were, Ron Paul being one of the more notable examples within the American political class. Or at least within Congress. I don't necessarily want to tie Ron Paul to the political class. But further, though, that all of those questions, all of those hesitancies would have been very prudent. 9/11, the response to 9/11 was an absolute disaster. And one of the big lessons from 9/11 was the lack of accountability on the domestic side for the complete breakdown of security. I know you've written about this topic in the past, about the complete failure of Washington to protect citizens during 9/11, and we can question, whether or not that was, incompetency or deliberate. I know plenty of people have strong opinions on both sides of that. But what I think is interesting is that there's a variety of polls out there showing that, unlike the U.S., which kind of rallied around George W. Bush coming off a very contentious election in 2000, within Israel, that has had its own political unrest, its own divides, very strong divides within the government, and issues that Netanyahu has faced in recent years, that a lot of the blame has been placed on, in public opinion, on Netanyahu for failing to defend, for allowing this to happen under his watch, for his previous views on Hamas and the support that the Israeli state had provided that as a way of delegitimizing other political pursuits with the Palestinians. And so it's going to be interesting to see, what does a Israeli state that is not enjoying that sort of blind follow the leader mentality from the political side, does a full-on war with Iran, does that help to consolidate that base and bring the U.S. in with it, or does that lead to more discontent, more questioning of further escalation? We shall see. We're still very early on in this. Speaking of the oil issue, one of the major players in the region is Qatar. They have threatened withholding their oil production as a response to the continual to Israel's continual assaults with high civilian casualties within Gaza. So obviously the oil as a geopolitical weapon is not going away anytime soon. And in the aftermath, we've actually seen a deal done with Venezuela in exchange for some political promises by the Maduro regime, and we're going to have free and open elections the next couple of years, yada yada. With a removal of U.S. sanctions to help utilize Venezuelan oil to help offset some of the Middle Eastern crisis, and see how that plays out in the long run. But it obviously that aspect of the situation, again, further heightened by American domestic policies, as you mentioned, is definitely a factor out there, particularly given that this is not the only issue going on in the globe. We're still dealing with ramifications from Ukraine and Russia. There's a lot of fires out there, but hey, at least we can sleep soundly at night knowing that we are represented by Joe Biden, that beacon of respectability on the global stage, and his crack team of geopolitical experts. So hey, at least we have that we can be assured that very serious conversations and the expert class is really looking out for our best interests there.
Yeah, if you wish to place your faith in the competence and goodwill of the current ruling class in Washington, I suppose you can, but don't come to me when you get real disappointed or incinerated by nuclear missiles. So there is reason for very deep concern. These people just love playing with fire. And it's clear they haven't learned a darn thing. They're still talking about how the United States can still fight a three-front war, if not more. No region of the globe is not to be controlled and ruled over by Washington in the thinking of these people. And so this latest conflict is just going to be used as yet another way to expand federal power, not just internationally, but here in the United States. And if you're under 40 years old, you may not remember the playbook terribly well. Obviously, if you were interested in this topic, then you were paying attention even back then. But most people who had other things to do, they may not see just how similar the playbook is shaping up to be between now and what it was in 2002, 2003, in terms of raising a lot of the same threats, using a lot of the same arguments, and using, yet again, a international conflict to push great expansions in federal power. So be ready to see a lot of that, but it'll really just come down to how excited or unexcited the public is. It could be that as the economy worsens as well, that there's going to be very little enthusiasm domestically for even more federal spending overseas, while the employment situation worsens in the U.S., while daily life continues to become unaffordable, and I think that will probably have some effect on the situation.
And there are a few domestic dynamics there that, again, this could all go out the window if you end up having a major terrorist attack within the United States, if you have, attacks on an aircraft carrier in the region, if, there's a variety of ways that this entire thing could change very, very quickly. But there are few, I think, domestic differences now than what we saw in 2001 that are worth noting. One is the general prestige of the military writ large is much lower than it was. We've talked about, we've made multiple references to the declining recruitment rates by the U.S. Armed Forces in all branches, not just the Army, but across the board, that they're having difficulty meeting their recruitment goals, and I think a large part of that goes to various cultural and social dynamics that have guided the military more than necessarily just a inherent uneasiness over warfare and the like, but that is undermining a lot of the recruitment capabilities that American Armed Forces have, and because of alternative media, you do see a lot of I think reflexive pushback towards the needs for blind support for Israel, for this sort of bloodthirsty. If we don't attack them over there, they're going to attack us here. This sort of civilizational sort of narratives that were running rapid in the peak Bush years. We've seen it obviously within conservative circles, where even someone like Matt Walsh, who was with the Daily Wire, a colleague of Ben Shapiro, I've been very pleased to see him speak very strongly about how the extent to which America cannot afford another war front. There's someone on Fox and Friends, that hotbed of intellectual rigor, was pushing back on Mark Levin for some of his statements there, and so again, all subject to change on a whim if things further escalate. But I was glad to see there's still a little bit more starch in the war skeptic right than I would have thought, given the specifics of this conflict. And so hopefully the breakdown, I think, that goes to the erosion of the influence of the corporate media, the sort of everyone repeats the same talking points there. I think that goes to the breakdown of the complete uniparty control of government, as we're seeing play out in the speaker's race currently on the back burner. There's still plenty of support for kind of uniparty, bipartisan agreement when it comes to a variety of issues, but there's plenty of holdouts there as well. There's a lot more than simply Ron Paul and Barbara Lee, complaining about, warning about this, that those coalitions have grown and have proven not to be easily trampled over. So there are some positives that we can make out from the general shift of kind of this recognition that this American empire is not providing any value to American citizens. But again, we are one really bad event happening from that being further tested still, which again is something that I think we all recognize as a real terrifying threat out there.
All right, well, with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up this episode of Radio Rothbard. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back next week with another episode, so we'll see you next time.